Hello and welcome to the Sandusky Library's try again. Hello and welcome to another cemetery walk from the Sandusky Library. My name is Jeremy Angstadt and I'm the Museum Services Manager for the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. Today we're going to be talking about the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic was a Union Army veterans group that formed after the Civil War, originally in 1866 in Illinois. To be a member, you had to have served in a Union Army regiment or some function sometime during the cut. One more time. Hello and welcome to another cemetery walk from the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. My name is Jeremy and I'm the Museum Services Manager. Today's cemetery walk is going to focus on the history of the cut. One more time. Hello and welcome to another cemetery walk. That wasn't enough. Cut. Hello and welcome to another cemetery walk from the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. My name is Jeremy Angstadt, the Museum Services Manager. Today we're going to focus on members of the Grand Army of the Republic from Sandusky Library. The Grand Army of the Republic is a Union Army veterans organization that formed in 1866, originally in Illinois. It spread throughout the country and it had peak membership in 1890. It was very important not just for social functions, but politically as well. It was a solid voting bloc, kind of like how the American Legion was in the 1960s, for those of you who may remember that. There were Grand Army of the Republic posts all over America, and there were several in Erie County. The ones we're going to be focused on today are members of the Grand Army of the Republic post here in Sandusky. In 1892, the Sandusky post had 246 members. It lasted a long time. The last member of the Grand Army of the Republic anywhere in the United States died in 1959 at the age of 109. So with that being said, we're going to head on over to the first grave. This is the grave of Dr. Robert R. McMeans. Dr. McMeans was born February 1820 in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania. He attended the University of Pennsylvania for medical school and graduated in 1841. After that, he moved out to Tiffin, Ohio. We're not exactly sure where. While there, he married his wife, Ann Pittenger, on August 31st, 1843. They didn't have any children of their own, but they did end up raising his wife's niece. Her name was Sarah. Sarah's parents, unfortunately, were killed by Native Americans in Texas and were sent up here to live with the McMeans. We know they moved to Sandusky in 1849, and he formed a volunteer militia here in town in 1851 and had about 60 members. Dr. McMeans was a very well-known doctor here in town. We know he served or worked with the Folletts, the Sloans, Frohman. You know, for those of you who are from the area, you recognize those names as big areas. In June of 1861, he enlisted as surgeon for the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. We know he was at the Battle of Richmond Mountain, West Virginia, which is kind of important to us here because while there, he captured a Confederate flag. Captured is a really interesting term because when you think of captured, you think of during a battle. But actually, he found it left behind in a Confederate hospital tent. He sent the flag to his wife and niece back home, and the niece actually donated the flag to the Sandusky Library for preservation in 1914, and it's still part of our collection today, and we use it to help tell the story of Dr. McMeans here. After that, he kept serving as surgeon. In October, we know he was promoted up to acting surgeon for the whole division, so a very big responsibility. But on October 30th, 1862, unfortunately, Dr. McMeans died in Perrysville, Kentucky. We're not sure what he died of. We know the night before he made his rounds, he talked about being tired. His colleagues had mentioned that he should go home and relax and try and recuperate a little bit, but he wanted to stay until the war was over. The next morning, unfortunately, they found him dead. So probably a heart attack, stroke, something along those lines. We're not sure. They sent his body back to Sandusky by train in early November. And on November 5th, they had a large ceremony in the cemetery here for him. They brought soldiers over from Johnson's Island prisoner of war camp to act as an honor guard, and the whole ceremony was conducted by the Freemasons, since he was one. And like I said, he was very well honored. And the grave we're actually looking at here isn't his original grave marker. His original grave marker is just behind us. This one was put up in honor of him. This was originally donated by other surgeons in the area who knew him and respected him, and it shows how important Dr. McMeans was to the medical community here. So with that, almost forgot. So the reason we're talking about Dr. McMeans, even though he died during the war, so it means he couldn't have been part of the Grand Army of the Republic, is the Grand Army of the Republic post in Sandusky is named after Dr. McMeans. It's called the McMeans GAR post, or was. Unfortunately, he didn't get to live to see it, but then it wouldn't have been named after him. Just like American Legion posts today are named after soldiers, the same thing was done with GAR posts. So with that being said, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Henry Schlieffler. He was born June 18th, 1841 in Germany. He came to Sandusky when he was about 13 years old with his family. He married his wife, Elizabeth Guth, in 1878, and Elizabeth was also from Germany. They had 4 children together. The first child we don't have a name for, unfortunately, and died somewhere between 1878 and 1880. They had, besides that one, they had Dorothea, Leonard, and Rosalind. Leonard, unfortunately, died in 1912. Henry served with the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. For those of you who may be familiar with Ohio history, the 23rd Ohio Infantry was the same regiment that Hayes and McKinley were a part of. So a very important regiment in the nation's history because they were both there. He originally enlisted in December of 1863. We know he served in several battles, Clouds Mountain, Lexington, Lynchburg, Winchester. Winchester would end up being his last battle because he was captured there in July of 1864. We know he spent 9 months as a prisoner of war, but I couldn't figure out which of the many Confederate prisons he stayed at. He was officially mustered out or discharged from the service on June 8th, 1865. He lived in Sandusky pretty much from 13 until he died. He lived here for 61 years. He originally worked as a steamboat engineer. Then he owned the Lakeview Hotel, which he bought in 1886, and owned that for several years until he sold it right around time he retired, 1908-ish. We know he was admitted to the Soldiers' Home here in town on May 18th, 1909. And he's actually lived there for a long time. He died there on September 9th, 1915. We're not sure what he died of. The cause of death is unlisted. We know they had a funeral here for him on September 11th, and they had a full service here on the graveside. So with that, we're going to head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Jacob Pye. He was born in Bavaria, Germany in 1840. He came to the U.S. in 1862 and originally lived in Bellevue area. He married his wife, Barbara. We're not exactly sure what year. They ended up having 5 children: Amelia, Frank, Henry, Jacob, and one who we couldn't find out her first name and just goes by Mrs. J. Baldoff. That's actually common. Once a person gets married during that time period, a woman, they usually go by Mrs. and then her husband's name. And unless you can find them in a census record, it's really hard to actually find their name. The children had, just while we're talking about them, had kind of some interesting stories. Their son Jacob was arrested for using a counterfeit bill in 1887 here in town. Their son John was shot by one of his assistants in 1897 out on the peninsula of Cedar Point. They were interviewed by the police and they both claimed it was an accident. They were having a shooting competition. I don't know if that's actually what happened, but it makes for a really good story. Going back to this Jacob, he enlisted in the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Cavalry in December of 1863. He was promoted to corporal in June of 1865 and eventually was mustered out of service in August of 1865. After the war, he moved to Sandusky in 1866. He was a stonemason. Probably his best known work that's still standing is he built Rush Sloane's house, which was recently restored and looks very good now, in 1879s. He worked as a stonemason until 1892. In January of 1902, he started complaining of heart pain. He complained about that for about 5 weeks, and unfortunately, towards the end of January 1902, he died. He died of heart failure. His funeral originally took place at the Zion German Lutheran Church here in Sandusky, and it was conducted by the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic escorted his body from his home, which was over on Campbell Street, to the church, and then they brought him here for internment. So with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Charles Baumann. He was born August 1836 in Baden, Germany. He came to Sandusky in 1850 at the age of 14. In 1856, he married his wife Eva, and they ended up having 11 children, 5 sons, Fred, Charles, Jacob, John, and Henry, and 6 daughters, Louisa, Lizzie, Amanda, Mrs. Conrad Lear, Mrs. Siphron Merles, and Mrs. Joseph Settler. He worked as a wallpaper painter, picture frames, and sign painter for 40 years. He owned his own business, and he retired just a few years before his death. He originally enlisted in the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry in February of 1865, and by May of 1865 he was mustered out because they didn't need him anymore. He was very popular in town besides his business. He was a member of the International Organization of Odd Fellows. So that's an organization you don't really hear about anymore. I don't know if they exist even anymore, but they originally formed to do good for people in need around the country. He was also the leader of the Germania Reed Band here in town. He was a member of the Great Western Reserve Band and of Ackley's Band. For some of you may know this, but Sandusky had a very rich history of different bands performing both in town and at Cedar Point over the years. He died on December 16th, 1906 on his home in Decatur Street. The cause of death was Bright's disease. Bright's disease is a problem involving the kidneys. He was 71 years old when he died. They originally had his funeral at his house, which was common during that time period, and then buried him out here in Oakland Cemetery. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Thomas McFall. He was born in Milan Township, January 4th, 1839. We know he lived in Milan until 1861 while working there. In 1861, his father was elected the county treasurer, and Thomas was the acting deputy county treasurer. He was in that role until 1863. From 1863 to 1880, we know he owned his own boot and shoe business in Milan still. But there was a break in there because in 1864, May of that year, he joined the 145th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. That was what they called a 100-day regiment. So they signed up and they were only going to serve for 100 days. Those regiments, and Thomas as well, was stationed around Washington, D.C. to help secure the capital. The idea was that they could use the less experienced regiments to man fortifications like that so they wouldn't have, they could get people in, because they had a hard problem trying to get people to sign up for 3 years or for the length of the war. He mustered out of service on August 24th, 1864. After the war, he ran a shipping business on the lake. One of the more interesting stories with Thomas McFall was in August 1880, he was in a railroad accident. He was on the train at Port Clinton. He was getting off the train and unfortunately fell onto the platform. And he fell and one of his legs ended up under the train. He slipped between the platform and the train. They ended up having to amputate most of his left leg, unfortunately. But it really didn't stop him. In 1881, he was elected the county auditor and served until 1883. In 1883, he was appointed the desk of corporation in the Secretary of State's office in Columbus, and he served there until 1887. In 1887, he returned back to Sandusky and worked at a warehouse for collecting taxes. And then in 1893, he was elected the county auditor. We know he married his wife Nettie. We're not exactly sure what year. They had 3 children, but unfortunately all the children died before Thomas did. He was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, obviously, and a member of the Freemasons here in town. He went to the Republican Convention in St. Louis in 1896 and came back fatigued, stomach problems, and unfortunately in July of that year he died. They held his funeral from his home, which was over on Central Avenue, on July 3rd. And pretty much all the major county officials attended the funeral because he was so important in the county and served so long. So with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Elisha M. Culver. He was born September 30th, 1832 in Hudson, New York. He moved with his family when he was very young to Monroeville, Ohio. We know he attended Cincinnati Law School to get his degree. He originally married Miss Clara Prout. We're not exactly sure what year, and they ended up having 3 children together, Frank, Mary, and Andrew. His first wife, Clara, died in 1874. 2 years later, he married Clara Wood in 1876. He originally set up law practice in Perrysburg, Wood County, Ohio. In September of 1861, he enlisted with the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Cavalry as a first lieutenant. A lot of these regiments would take people who were highly educated, like a lawyer, and make them into officers even if they didn't have any military experience. He was promoted to captain in 1861 in June of that year. June of 1862, not 61. He took part in several major battles: the Siege of Corinth, Mississippi, Stone River, Chickamauga, Kennesaw Mountain, and in September of 1864, he resigned his commission and left the military. In 1865, he moved to Sandusky. He served 2 terms as the city solicitor, then served 9 years as a probate judge for Erie County. We know he practiced law in Ottawa and Huron counties as well, and was very active in the Masons and was a popular speaker at different events around the county. In September of 1895, he went to the big Grand Army of the Republic encampment, like their national meetings in Louisville. He also attended while there the dedication of Chickamauga National Park. When he came back from that, he returned sick, and at the end of September 1895, he died in his home in Jefferson, that was on Jefferson Street. And they ruled his cause of death heart troubles. They had a big Masonic funeral at his home, and he was actually buried in his Masonic Knight Templar uniform, but he was wearing a Grand Army of the Republic button to symbolize his membership in that as well. They actually held the funeral on the lawn of his house because there were so many people there and how popular he was, and it was attended by all the major public figures in town. He was buried with a Masonic flag, and the Masonic Temple flew their flag at half-mast to kind of represent and honor him. So with that, we're going to head on over to the next grave. This is a grave of William W. Woodward. He was born July 4th, 1834 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Amelia and Charles Woodward. Sometime during the war, after the Civil War, he married his wife Florence. He originally joined the 1st Ohio Volunteer Infantry in April of 1861 as a 2nd lieutenant. That regiment ended in August of 1861. Then he joined the 44th Ohio Volunteer Infantry as a captain in September of 1861. He resigned that commission in July of 1862. In that same month, he joined the Ohio Volunteer Cavalry as a 2nd lieutenant. In November of 1862, he was promoted to captain of the 2nd Ohio Volunteer Cavalry. And then of July of 1864, he becomes the colonel of the 116th United States Colored Troop, which the United States Colored Troops were the all African-American regiments that the federal government raised. Then he eventually mustered out December of 1865. He saw action at a lot of the major battles: First Battle of Bull Run, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Siege of Petersburg and Richmond, and Appomattox Courthouse. So he was at the first major battle of the war and one of the last major battles of the war. After the war, we know he ran a grocery store in Dayton. He moved back to Sandusky sometime between 1875 and 1878. He was the head of the Hoover and Woodward grocery store, which eventually got renamed the Bender and Woodward grocery store. We know he was involved in many other businesses around town. He had one son, Charles, and one daughter, which we couldn't find the name of, unfortunately. He died on April 5th, 1913, at his home on Washington Street. They held the funeral at his home, and then, of course, they brought his body out here for interment. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Charles Dennis. Charles was born in Constantia, New York, August of 1843. In 1852, the family moved to the Sandusky area to continue farming. He enlisted with the 101st Ohio Volunteer Infantry in August of 1862, and he was wounded at the battle. This is the grave of Charles Dennis. Charles Dennis was born in Constantia, New York, August of 1843. In 1852, the family moved to the Sandusky area to continue farming. In August of 1862, he enlisted with the 101st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He was wounded at the Battle of Stone River. For those of you who may have studied Ohio history, you may have heard of the Battle of Stone River, obviously not in Ohio, but the reason it's important is there were a lot of a lot of Ohio regiments served in that battle. And besides Charles Dennis being wounded, one of the more famous people who was wounded in the battle, of course, was Rutherford B. Hayes, where he was wounded in the arm. He served until June of 1865 when he was mustered out in Nashville. In 1878, he married his wife Jane Scott, and they had 2 children, Charles and Laura. After the war, he worked at first as a clerk in a store in Sandusky, and then he worked for the Kelly's Island Lime and Transport Company as secretary of the company from 1882 to sometime in the 1890s. When he left the Kelly's Island Company, he moved to Findlay to work in a furniture company for a while. Then he came back to Sandusky, we're not sure when, and worked as a postmaster here in Sandusky for 4 years. He was the treasurer for the Soldiers' Home, the Veterans' Home as it's known now today, and he was actually working there up until about 10 days before his death. Unfortunately, he died on May 28th, 1917, at the Soldiers' Home. They conducted the service at the church at Soldiers' Home, but they had him buried out here on May 31st. So with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Ephraim Adams. He was born September of 1831 in Crawford County, Ohio. He served with the 136th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He joined in May of 1864, and he was a wagoner for the company, so that means he transported supplies. And he was once again in another 100-day regiment where they were stationed in Washington to guard forts. So he mustered out August 31st, 1864. He went back to Crawford County after the war and worked as a carpenter. He married, before the war, he married Lucia Brown in Ohio in August of 1862. He moved back to Sandusky sometime around 1881, 1882 and worked as a carpenter. He was a member of the International Order of Oddfellows, which we talked about before. He was admitted to the Soldiers' Home on January of 1891, and he actually stayed there a long time. He died September 1917 at the Soldiers' Home. He was 86 years old. We don't have a real cause of death. They just put old age. When he died in the end of September of 1917, they actually had a rash of deaths then. They had 8 soldiers die between September 21st and September 23rd. They had a funeral on September 5th at the home of one of his sons that was over on Taylor Street, and then they brought him here for internment. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Frederick Beil. He was born in Germany on March 22nd, 1827. He came to the United States in 1849. He married his wife Barbara, and they actually had 7 children together, 5 sons and 2 daughters. Mrs. Margaret Hall, Mrs. William Knight, Jacob, Fred, Louis, Charles, and Conrad. In August of 1862, he enlisted with the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry for 3 years. He fought at Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Enterprise Farders, Sumtersville, South Carolina, Swift Creek, South Carolina. He was captured at Gettysburg on July 1st and sent to Libby Prison. He was returned to his company in September 1864, probably as part of a prisoner exchange. He was mustered out of service in July of 1865 with his regiment. He worked in the lumber yards here in town, and he died on August 14th, 1900 in his home on Warren Street. They had his funeral here on August 16th. Well, first they had the funeral at his home, and then at the German Reformed Church, and then finally they had the cemetery service here at the cemetery. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of John Ernst. He was born November 1841 in Ohio, and he moved to the Sandusky area somewhere around 1847, 1848. He originally enlisted with a 3-month regiment, but after that he re-enlisted with the 65th Ohio Volunteer Infantry in November of 1861. He fought at the battles of Shiloh, Stone River, Perrysville, Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, and he was wounded at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. We know he was promoted to corporal at some point in time, we're not sure when, and in August 1864 he was discharged on a surgeon's certificate, so it means he was either too sick or his wound had gotten too bad that he couldn't serve anymore. He returned to Sandusky after the war. Here he married his wife Christina Rader. They ended up having 3 daughters and 4 sons together, Mary, Rose, Albert, Ernest, Rollin, and Paul. For a short period of time, John Ernst owned a small papering town called the Democrat. It was a local German language paper. Besides that, he also worked in a printing shop besides the newspaper. After retiring, he worked for different charitable organizations that help veterans. We're not sure exactly what he died from, but the descriptions, it sounds like he may have had a stroke. And in July 18th, 1917, he died in his home in Perry Street, and he was 76 years old. They held his funeral at his home on July 20th. Then they took his body to the Calvary Church for another service, and then finally laid him to rest here. This is a particularly fitting place to end our walk, because this lot that you can see, the graves you see in shot and the ones you can't see around you, are all Civil War veterans. This was a lot put aside by Oakland Cemetery to bury Civil War veterans in. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the walk. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. And thank you for enjoying another walk from the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. Hope to see you for the next one.